Next, on American History TV, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Eric Lichtblau talks about his book, The Nazis Next Door: How America Became a Safe Haven for Hitler's Men. He discusses how many Nazis were granted clearance by the U.S. government after World War II and were employed as scientists, intelligence officers, engineers, and spies. This was recorded at Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. in 2014. It's about an hour.
We're really fortunate to have with us this evening an experienced investigative reporter, Eric Lichtblau. Eric first got into investigative journalism at the Los Angeles Times, where he worked for 15 years. His final beat for the Los Angeles Times was in Washington, covering the Justice Department. And when he shifted to the New York Times 12 years ago, he continued covering justice. This left him well-positioned and very well-sourced after the September 11th attacks to report on the Bush administration's stepped-up domestic spying operations. And in 2006, he and another New York Times reporter, James Risen, received the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting for, as the Pulitzer Committee put it, quote, "their carefully sourced stories on the secret domestic eavesdropping that stirred a national debate on the boundary line between fighting terrorism and protecting civil liberty." That reporting led Eric a couple of years later to come out with his first book, Bush's Law: The Remaking of American Justice, on the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program and other secret activities. In his new book, the Nazis Next Door, Eric elaborates on another and older story of covert activity, this one recounting how the CIA and FBI brought former Nazis into the United States after World War II to serve as spies and informants in the Cold War against the Soviet bloc. While some of this story has been known, Eric reveals a far more extensive recruitment of former Nazis. And years later, when the Justice Department was searching for former Nazis in this country, the investigations were complicated by the efforts of other government agencies to conceal their own involvement and the pasts of those being hunted. It wasn't until the first years of this century that the U.S. government acknowledged much of this dark history. But even that acknowledgement came only in a secret internal Justice Department report that officials didn't want to release. In 2010, Eric wrote a story about that document, which became the impetus for his book. A review of the book in the New York Times said Eric, quote, "brings ample investigative skills and an elegant writing style to this unsavory but important story. The Nazis Next Door is a captivating book rooted in first-rate research." And another reviewer called the book, quote, "a fascinating and infuriating corrective to the American mythology of the good war." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Eric Lichtblau.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's always great to be back at Politics and Prose, and was happy to read in the paper this morning that you all are expanding to other locations, which is great news for everyone in Washington who loves books. So congratulations on that. This book began with a tip. I got a tip about 4 years ago now from a source who told me that there was a secret report at the Justice Department that laid bare the whole internal history of the government's efforts to find and deport Nazis in the United States going back more than 3 decades. Yet for mysterious reasons, the source said, the Justice Department had been sitting on this report for 3-4 years at that point. Never would put it out publicly. There's something really interesting, some interesting new stuff in there, the source told me. You should see if you can get your hands on it. Now, one sure way to get a reporter's attention is to tell them that there's a secret report that the government doesn't want you to see. It's kind of like waving a big hunk of red meat in front of a hungry dog. And of course, I bit. I wanted to get the report, and eventually, through a bit of blind luck, I did. It was fascinating stuff, just as promised. And it concluded by declaring sadly, that America, in the years after the war, had allowed itself to become a quote-unquote safe haven for Nazis. I wrote a story for the New York Times that ended up on the front page about the report. But I think even before I finished writing the story, I realized that there was a book here to be written. There was so much history here, and such shameful history in a lot of ways, that it demanded closer attention. You know, I had that feeling that you get sometimes as a reporter when you think you're on to an important story. You tell yourself, there's more here, and there was. So this book is mostly, of course, about the Nazis who fled to America after the war. But in another way, it's also about the Holocaust survivors themselves, who were the victims in those concentration camps. And that's not something I intended to really focus on in the book. That took me by surprise as I was doing my research. And I realized as I looked at that period immediately after the war, beginning in the spring of 1945, that to truly understand how maddeningly easy it was for the Nazis to get into America, you have to first appreciate and first understand how horribly, horrifically difficult it was for the Holocaust survivors, for their victims, to get out of the concentration camps at that very same time. So indulge me for a few minutes while I read to you from the first chapter of my book, which is called Liberation. And this is what liberation looked like for the survivors. Spring 1945, foreign-walled displaced persons camp outside Munich. While the Nazis fled, their victims were left to languish. These were the quote-unquote lucky ones, hundreds of thousands of Jews, Catholics, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, Roma, and other so-called parasites enslaved in Nazi concentration camps, who somehow had managed to survive Hitler's genocidal killing machine. Yet even after Germany's defeat, the survivors remained imprisoned for months in the same camps where the Nazis had first put them to rot. The names of their jailers had changed, with the dark Nazi swastikas now replaced by the bright-colored flags of the Allied victors flying above the camps. But the barbed wire fences and armed guards still encircled them. They were in a post-war purgatory. Jakob Bieber, a Jew who survived the Nazi purge in the Ukraine, was among the masses confined in that American DP camp in Foreign-Walled. Quote, "We felt like so much surplus junk," Bieber would write of his confinement, "human garbage which the governments of the world wished would somehow go away." The Allies had come at Hitler from all sides in those early months of 1945, the Russians from the east, the Americans and the British from the west. One by one, the Allied forces discovered scenes of horror and madness in concentration camps abandoned by the retreating Nazis. Inside the camps remained tens of thousands of survivors amid heaps of unburied corpses. Generations later, the mind's eye imagines the world embracing the survivors. The iron gates to the camps must have swung open at the arrival of the Allied forces, and a mass of bone-thin victims must have poured out into the awaiting arms of a world filled at once with shock, guilt, and joy over their rescue. Like trapped coal miners freed from a mine shaft, or a wrongly accused prisoner emerging from behind the prison walls, they were free at last. Hot meals, warm beds, showers, and doctors must have awaited them. The reality was much darker. Many thousands of the survivors did not leave the Allied camps, some not for months, some not for years, some not at all. Thousands died from disease and malnourishment even after Hitler's defeat. At Dachau, at Bergen-Belsen, and at dozens of DP camps like them, they remained jailed inside the walls that Hitler had erected. With the survivors surrounded by the stench of death and squalor, the liberating Allied forces, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, would not allow them to leave. The world didn't know what to do with them. Crowded and ill-fed, the survivors were left to wear their striped camp uniforms, the same uniforms that had become such a toxic symbol of Nazi oppression. In some DP camps, they were bunked side by side with Nazi POWs who were held there as well, people who just months earlier had been their wartime tormentors. Some Nazi prisoners were even put in charge of Jewish inmates at the Allied camps, ruling over them even in defeat. Exiled Jews in the camp, who were originally from Germany, Austria, and other Axis nations, were classified and treated by the Allies not as victims, but as enemy nationals because of their countries of origin, no different from the Nazi prisoners jailed with them. Many of the Germans had it better. At Allied-run camps reserved for German prisoners of war, ex-Nazi officers watched movies, played soccer, even took college courses. At Jewish TP camps, meanwhile, the Holocaust survivors fought merely to get an extra ration of soggy black bread and coffee to make up for the starvation of the war years. American officials resisted. They complained the Jews were getting preferential treatment and were using black market systems at the camps to violate limits on food rations. The situation became so volatile that the German police, with the consent of American officials, staged a raid on black market activities in the Stuttgart and Landsberg camps in early 1946. Rioting broke out, with police killing one Jewish DP. He had survived the Holocaust, but not its aftermath. Now, word began to get back to Washington, to Jewish groups, about these horrific conditions, even in victory, that the survivors were experiencing. And Washington didn't want to believe it. Truman didn't want to believe it. The Senate didn't want to believe it. The House didn't want to believe it. Finally, the calls for some action grew so loud that Truman had to appoint a special emissary to go over to the displaced person camps and investigate whether or not these reports of such horrific living conditions could really be true. I've seen a lot of damning reports in Washington covering this town. This was about the most damning report I've ever read. What the dean of Pennsylvania at that time, a man named Earl Harrison, wrote back to Truman was that, quote, "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews just as the Nazis treated them, except that, except that we do not exterminate them. The Nazis' victims," the dean found, were being victimized once again, but this time by the Americans. So how could this have happened? How could liberation look so tragic for the survivors of the Holocaust? As I said, when I began my research for this book, I didn't really intend to look at the survivors. That seemed somewhat to the side of the story of the Nazi fugitives. This was a book about the Nazis, but as I looked more deeply into the horrific treatment of the prisoners, I wanted to know, how could this have happened? I was doing a fellowship at the Holocaust Museum for much of last year, and I began rummaging around in the archives when I came across a handwritten page in the diary of the man who ran the camps for the United States. I'm sure you've heard of him. His name was General George S. Patton. He's a subject of a fawning biography by a guy on Fox News, Bill O'Reilly, I think is his name. The old blood and guts was his nickname, war hero, tough talking, kind of the caricature of the great American hero. Also, as it turns out, a brutal anti-Semite. This is what I found in Patton's journal when he described his reaction to that report that I just read to you, that Truman received from Earl Harrison, the dean of the Penn Law School. Give me 1 second, I'm sorry. This is what Patton wrote. Quote, "Harrison and his ilk believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not, and this applies particularly to the Jews, who were lower than animals," Patton wrote in his diary after learning of the scathing report to Truman. Laying bare the rabid anti-Semitism that infected the American refugee effort, Patton complained of how the Jews in one DP camp with, quote, "no sense of human relationships would defecate on the floors and live in filth like lazy locusts." He told of taking General Eisenhower to tour a makeshift synagogue that the Jews had set up to celebrate, the holy day of Yom Kippur. "We entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stink of mass humanity I have ever seen," Patton wrote. This was Eisenhower's first glimpse of the DPs, Patton wrote, so it was all new to him. Quote, "Of course, I have seen them since the beginning and marveled that beings alleged to be made in the form of God can look the way they do or act the way they act." Remember, this was the general in charge of the prisoners for the Allied forces who had just won the war. And yet he could speak with such vulgarity and such blatant anti-Semitism. At first, when I read this, I thought this must be a forgery. I found it hard to believe that General Patton had really written these words. So I went to a second source to find out whether this was an authentic document. And sadly, unfortunately, it was. And there were many other episodes in Patton's career that affirmed his views towards the prisoners and how he felt toward them. At the same time, he had an almost odd fondness and admiration for the Nazi POWs in his camps. Despite orders from Eisenhower to denazify post-war Germany, Patton insisted on using Nazis as camp administrators and allowing them to keep their posts in civilian government after the war. Quote, "If you need these men," Patton told one of his officers, "keep them and don't worry about anything else." He saw them as brutally efficient, and they were in the best position to run the camps. I tell another story about Patton in the book that's also illuminating as far as his views and admiration for the Nazi prisoners. And let me read that for a second. Weeks after Germany's surrender, General Patton visited a German POW barracks and sought out a senior Nazi prisoner who was being held there, a German general and scientist named Walter Dornberger. A leading German rocketeer, Dornberger had run the Nazis' V-2 missile program and had overseen the work of Werner von Braun and the other technical experts who built the missiles that Hitler had used in Europe to devastating effect. Quote, "Are you the guy who was in charge of the development of the V-2 rockets?" Patton asked Dornberger. "Jawohl, Herr General," Dornberg answered with a nod. Patton, impressed, pulled 3 cigars from his pocket and handed them to his Nazi rival. "My congratulations," Patton said. "I couldn't have done it." So I began to realize in my research that the horrific, unfathomable treatment of the survivors really had everything to do with this easy path to America that greeted the Nazis. And I began to use that as a framework for the story. You have to remember that for every Jew who did not get into America or into Palestine in those difficult years, that was one more visa for a Nazi collaborator, maybe disguised as a POW, disguised as a farmer, disguised as a civilian administrator, to get into America. The visas were a precious commodity in those early years. With some 7 million people left stateless in Europe after the war, 40,000 visas were the small lot that was issued in the first 3 years after the war. And the immigration policies were stacked against the Jews in trying to get those precious few. This is what a Senate lawyer wrote when he was trying to limit the number of survivors allowed into America immediately after the war. The Jews, quote, "do not desire to work, but expect to be cared for." The visas were a golden ticket out, and for every Jew who was kept in the brutal camps and denied an exit to America, that meant one more visa available for someone else. In those early years after the war, fully 40% of all the visas went by design to refugees from the Baltics. Hundreds of thousands of people from the so-called captive states that are occupied by the Nazis during the war. Hundreds of thousands of Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Ukrainians, and others. These were people who, as one U.S. policymaker put it, were of good stock and good breeding, and they were welcomed in America. Now, I don't want to diminish the victimization of many of those refugees. No doubt the vast majority of those 400,000 were, in fact, war refugees and legitimate victims who had just been held captive by a Nazi-occupied state or were about to be held effectively captive by the Soviet bloc for decades more. But among those 400,000, it's now clear that there were many thousands of Nazis and Nazi collaborators who played an active role in the Holocaust during the Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe. These were people who were police chiefs under the Nazis, who were prison wardens, who were camp guards at concentration camps, who were interrogators, who played every role you can imagine in terms of being what's often called Hitler's willing executioners during the occupation of Eastern Europe. There were men like Karl Linus, a police official who ran a Nazi concentration camp in Tartu, Estonia, where thousands and thousands of Jews were shot to death on his orders at a death pit in the camp. Linus was the one who would lead the school children from the bus that took them to the camp, to the edge of the death pit, in their underwear, making sure to save the dolls and belongings afterwards in a bit of morbid safekeeping. He was able to disguise himself easily as a war refugee and get into America on a visa and lived on Long Island quietly for 36 years. There were also men like Jacob Reimer, a Ukrainian who settled in Queens and made a good living managing a restaurant and selling Wise potato chips around the city. His visa application had him down as a POW during the war. It left out some of the more haunting aspects of his wartime biography, serving as a decorated officer for the SS, taking part in raids of the Jewish villages, training guards at Trebniki. Half a century later, Justice Department prosecutors came after Reimer and others like him to deport him for his role with the Nazis. This was how one of the prosecutors explained the math of post-war immigration politics to the judge. Quote, "He was never entitled to immigrate to America. There were only a limited number of visas back then. and he took the visa of a real victim. One more Nazi in America meant one less actual victim who got to leave the brutal camps and come to America. It was simple math. And so they came. Thousands of Nazi collaborators scattered across America, in Queens, in Boston, in Baltimore, in Washington, in Chicago, in Los Angeles. As Jacob Reimer and Carl Linnes showed, it wasn't hard. You identified yourself as a POW or a farmer or a civil servant. You simply put down a fake name. Antonin Artukovich got into America simply using an alias, and he lived in Southern California for more than 30 years. If he'd used his real name, immigration officials might have realized that he was a top cabinet minister in the Nazi-occupied state of Croatia, the man who actually signed the racist and anti-Semitic decrees rounding up hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Roma, and Jews. But of course, they didn't know that, and they didn't check. There was really little chance of getting caught, since the post-war refugee system in Europe was so overwhelmed and so inept. Think of the flawed rollout of Obamacare, but without the computers. So thousands of Nazis came in quietly through the back door, disguised as someone else. But several thousand others came in through the front door, essentially invited by the US government, the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, and other intelligence branches. I mentioned General Dornberger, the head of the Nazis' V2 program. He and some 1,600 Nazi scientists came to America after the war in a secret program that you might have heard about. It was called Program Paperclip. The program was all about the Cold War and defeating the Soviets. The idea was to keep pace with the Russian scientists. And so we brought over our own teams of German scientists. Now, officially, the people we brought over couldn't be, quote unquote, ardent Nazis, whatever that might have meant. But this was clearly a fig leaf that was disregarded very quickly. And in fact, these were high-ranking Nazi officials who worked in Hitler's scientific program, who were involved in building rockets on the backs of slave laborers, doing medical experiments on prisoners, and worse. Dornberger and von Braun, for instance, built Hitler's rockets at a camp called Dora Mittelwerks in Nordhausen in Germany. They didn't build them themselves, of course. Slave laborers did that for them. Most of the prisoners were POWs, not Jews for the most part, but French, Russians, Poles, and others. And the Nazis literally worked them to death, building their rocket ships. The more rockets Hitler wanted built to bomb London and Antwerp, the faster he wanted them, the more prisoners died doing it. Some 10,000 slave laborers died there in all, of disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and worse. If workers didn't perform their daily quota, or if they were sometimes suspected of trying to sabotage the parts so that the rockets wouldn't work, they were taken to a giant construction crane in the middle of the work site and hanged, while all the other prisoners were made to come around and watch as a lesson of what would befall them if they tried the same thing. This was the place that these non-ardent Nazis ran before they came to America and set up shop in Alabama. Unlike the discovery of Dachau and many of the other camps we talked about, Americans didn't hear much about the liberation of this place at Nordhausen, and I suspect that that was by design. U.S. military officials weren't anxious to let the Soviets, or Americans for that matter, know that they were raiding this rocket factory, raiding it not only of its hardware, parts, and blueprints, but of its scientists and engineers as well, and bringing them back to live as Americans in Alabama, in Texas, in Ohio, in California. A man by the name of Arthur Rudolph was the head of rocket production at Nordhausen. He reported to Wernher von Braun. He came to the U.S. with the paperclip scientists. He became one of the top engineers in the Saturn space program. Not as famous as Wernher von Braun, but within his own scientific community, quite renowned. Decades later, prosecutors confronted him about what had really happened under his watch at that slave labor factory at Nordhausen. Rudolph said he just built rockets. The prisoners, as far as he knew, he said with a straight face, were well treated. He was just doing his job. A bunch of Nazi doctors came over under paperclip too, 36 just in San Antonio. One of them was named Dr. Hubertus Strughold. What Wernher von Braun was to rocket science, Strughold was to space medicine. He was a revered scientist, the father of space medicine, they called him. His job was to keep pilots alive in space in the changing atmosphere. And he was doing it long before he got to Texas. In Germany, he and the Nazi doctors under him in the medical experimentation programs ran and oversaw the grisly experiments on prisoners at Dachau and elsewhere, even on children, to see what the body could withstand. Children were put into a flight simulator and subjected to sudden, violent changes in altitude. Many died. Other prisoners were made to drink putrid seawater until they vomited or died. The idea was to see how much seawater the Nazi pilots could withstand and survive once their planes crashed, as was happening often during the war itself. He was brought over to America and was feted as an American hero. You could make the case, I suppose, and some have, that morality aside, the scientific expertise that the Nazis brought to America outweighed the obvious Nazi baggage that they brought with them. If it wasn't for von Braun's work on jet propulsion and Strughold's theories on space medicine, the U.S. might never have landed on the moon in 1969 ahead of the Russians. So the argument goes. Immoral or not, the recruitment of the Nazi spies brought the United States clear technological breakthroughs. But there's another group of hundreds of Nazis who were also aided and protected by the U.S. government, and I write about them in my book. You can't, for this group, you can't even make the, well, it was worth it argument. These are the most insidious group in my mind, the Nazi spies, who were used by the CIA, the FBI, OSS, defense military agencies, and others as anti-Soviet assets in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and inside the United States itself. The thinking was that no one hated the Soviets more than the Nazis, and American intelligence gurus like J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and Allen Dulles at the CIA wanted to put that hatred and that vitriol and that expertise against the Soviets to work by anointing the ex-Nazi spies as American spies, Cold War spies, and informants. Dulles, in fact, started dealing with the Nazis even before the war was over. I tell the story in the book of how Allen Dulles, who went on to become the CIA director later, met a few months before the end of the war with a Nazi general, Karl Wolff, a top SS man who had been Himmler's chief of staff. Wolff was the general who was in charge of developing the train system that, of course, took millions of victims to their deaths. Yet, he and Allen Dulles, with the war still waging, sat by a fireside at a safe house in Zurich and sipped scotch while talking in German about common acquaintances and mutual interests. Dulles sent a series of really amazing cables back to Washington after that meeting in which he described General Wolff, again, a Nazi general, chief of staff to Himmler, as one of the moderate Nazis, that was his word, not mine, who could help America. He was an attractive, romantic man who wanted to put the war behind him, and he could help America in Dulles's view. Now, as I wrote about in the book and in the New York Times last week in a story we did adapted from the book, there were as many as 1,000 Nazis who worked for the U.S. as spies in the Cold War after 1945, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and some in the United States itself. Unlike the technology, though, that von Braun and the Nazi engineers brought to America, much of the information that these Nazi spies brought to the U.S. proved worthless. I spent weeks at the National Archives in College Park going through now declassified intelligence files on the Nazi spies, and their value to the U.S. was practically non-existent. It should surprise no one sitting here, although it did the CIA at the time, that once these ex-Nazis went to work for the United States, they turned out to be liars, thieves, and drunks. Some, in fact, turned out to be Soviet double agents. The obvious lesson, which U.S. officials didn't seem to get at first, was that you couldn't trust a Nazi. One of the Nazi spies, for instance, was a man named Alexandros Leleikis, who lived in Massachusetts for years and years after the war. Before that, for the Nazis, he had worked as a Secret Service police chief in Lithuania during massacres there at the start of the war. Leleikis was the one who would sign the orders rounding up the Jews, thousands and thousands of Jews from around Vilnius, and turn them over to the Gestapo, where 60,000 of them were led to a death pit outside town and massacred to death. His signature was at the bottom of those orders. And yet, in the view of the CIA, he was a Cold War asset. He became a spy in Europe for America, even though in the CIA's own files, they noted almost in passing that he was under the control of the Gestapo during the war and that he was probably involved in the massacres at Vilnius. But he was U.S. material. Probably the most insidious of the Nazi spies, and a man I devote a fair amount of attention to in the book, was a Prussian baron by the name of Otto von Bolschwing. He also was a CIA spy in the 1950s, though also not a very good one. Once on a train in Austria in 1953, he lost a suitcase filled with top secret U.S. documents, getting it mixed up with another passenger's luggage. He opened the bag and realized that instead of secret spy photos, there were pajamas and a shaving kit. But the CIA, even after that, even after accusing him of foolhardiness for losing the luggage, kept him on board anyway and even helped him to move to the United States, where he lived in New York and then later California for decades. The CIA said that his relocation to the United States, which included essentially whitewashing his record of any notations to his Nazi service, was what they called a reward for his CIA service and in view of the quote-unquote innocuousness of his Nazi activities. Now, innocuousness is an odd choice of terms when you consider who von Bolschwing worked for in Germany. His boss in the Jewish Affairs Office was a man who I'm sure you know by the name of Adolf Eichmann. He was the architect, of course, of the final solution. And in the years before the war, von Bolschwing was not only a mentor and advisor to Eichmann and the Nazis, but a policymaker who devised ways of terrorizing the Jews in the hope that they would be so victimized that they would flee Germany and Europe altogether. So this is what von Bolschwing wrote for Eichmann in a paper in 1938 called The Jewish Problem. Von Bolschwing wrote, "A largely anti-Jewish atmosphere must be created among the people in order to form the basis for the continued attack and the effective exclusion of them. The most effective means is the anger of the people leading to excesses in order to take away the sense of security from the Jews. Even though this is an illegal method, it has had a long-standing effect. The Jew has learned a lot through the pogroms of the past centuries and fears nothing as much as a hostile atmosphere which can go spontaneously against him at any time." Now, in the National Archive documents that I mentioned I spent quite a bit of time examining, I found some fascinating documents from the CIA files on Otto von Bolschwing from 1960. Now, for those of you with long memories may remember the pivotal Nazi event in 1960 was the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina by the Israelis in a bold mission, secret mission that no one in the US or anywhere else knew about in advance. They kidnapped him from a bus stop not far from his home as he was returning home from work, and they swept him out of the country and back to Israel to stand trial in what would become one of the great famous trials of the 20th century, and he was ultimately executed for his role as the architect of the final solution. Now, the raid made headlines, of course, around the world, but for Otto von Bolschwing in New York City, he lived in a very nice apartment in the Upper East Side, this was a terrifying moment. He was worried that his name was going to come out at Eichmann's trial. And in fact, he was right. It came out several times. Eichmann credited him as one of the early pioneers of the anti-Jewish policies. And he was worried that the Israelis were going to find out that he himself was living in New York and would come swoop in and get him too. He'd already built up a good life for himself in New York as a successful international businessman with his Nazi past behind him. In fact, he was even being nominated at that very time for a big job with the State Department in India, an export-import job. And now he thought that all of that was at risk. So he went for help back to the CIA. The CIA, of course, was worried too about their own exposure if Bolschwing's links to the agency became known. They wrote in one memo in 1961, quote, "It's our assumption that von Bolschwing may be named as an Eichmann collaborator and a fellow conspirator, and that the resulting publicity may prove embarrassing to the US if the subject becomes involved with the State Department or its activities." So the CIA came up with a plan. They would protect Bolschwing. They would not tell the Israelis. They would not tell the Justice Department. They would not tell anyone else. They wouldn't tell Simon Wiesenthal or any of the Nazi hunters that Eichmann's former aide was living a quiet life in New York City. But there was one condition for their protection. They told von Bolschwing that he had to drop that bid for the State Department job because they couldn't risk his name being tied to Eichmann and the CIA. And in closing, let me read to you just a little bit from a series of remarkable meetings and horrifying meetings, to be honest, that the CIA held with Bolschwing in 1961. And so, on a spring evening in New York City, two CIA officials who worked with von Bolschwing during his spy days in Eastern Europe sat him down to deliver the ultimatum: either relinquish the State Department job or risk the messy consequences. Despite the ominous message, von Bolschwing's visitors struck a conciliatory tone. The CIA, his old handler began, valued his, quote, continued friendship Agency officials did feel a bit duped by everything they were now learning of his close ties to Eichmann, his handler claimed. But no one was angry with him, he stressed, and the meeting wasn't meant as a punishment. The purpose of this meeting, it was explained, was to draw his attention to the scandal that might result if he pressed his desire for employment with the State Department, his handler wrote afterward. Eichmann's arrest had simply made it impossible for von Bolschwing to serve in a government post, they told him. Von Bolschwing protested. It was ridiculous for anyone to suggest that he'd been Eichmann's collaborator, he said. He brought out a denazification certificate he had received in Austria after the war. Surely that was evidence of his innocence, wasn't it? He tried to walk his old CIA colleagues through his career with the Nazis, to explain how he'd been forced to join the party and played only a nominal role before turning against Hitler. They cut him off. They had expected his strident denials. They had read through all the new material linking him to Eichmann in the Jewish Affairs Office. It was obvious, his handler told von Bolschwing, that he had told the CIA far less than the truth about his Nazi activities. Just as an aside, they knew he was a Nazi, they just didn't realize quite how bad a Nazi he was. Back to the script, okay? As much as he liked von Bolschwing, his handler said, it was impossible to believe from the SS records in their possession that he was anything but an active participant and full partner in Eichmann's operations in Nazi Germany. That was all likely to spill out into public view if he pushed ahead with the State Department posting, his handler warned him. The record of his SS activities with Eichmann, if it became known, would surely make him a pariah in America and Europe. There was a risk not just of public shaming, but of a war crimes prosecution. Did he really want to go through, quote, the anguish and expense of a legal trial before a West German or Israeli court, his handler asked? No, von Bolschwing finally agreed. He didn't want to take such a risk. Realizing there was no way to press on with his job application, he agreed to withdraw his name from consideration. He would cite personal reasons, his health perhaps. The Nazi issue would not be mentioned. His handler would draft a telegraph to the State Department the following day, along with a letter to one of his congressional supporters who had strongly backed him for a job, they agreed. Von Bolschwing was despondent over seeing his Nazi past suddenly thrown back at him 15 years after the war. Twice he mentioned suicide to his CIA friends. He was particularly worried about how to explain to his wife his sudden change of heart over this India job. She'd been depressed recently, and she was still recovering from a car accident. This would no doubt upset her even more, he confided. She knew little about his past, he said, and she wasn't the type who could live out her life with a guilty secret. Grudgingly, he settled on a plan. He would admit to his wife that before the war, before they were married, he had worked for the Nazis in immigrating Jews out of Germany. His work was now being subjected to unfair misinterpretation in the wake of Eichmann's capture, he would tell her, and he was pulling his name for the State Department job as a result. That was all she needed to know. And what about his American citizenship? Von Bolschwing was worried about that too. He'd received his citizenship papers only 2 years before. Was his immigration status now in danger too? The CIA couldn't make any guarantees, his handler told him, but the agency would do what it could by working to ensure that no one else outside the CIA's security channels found out about his deep ties to Eichmann. Von Bolschwing's dark secrets were safe with the CIA. No one else needed to know. Von Bolschwing was satisfied. As upset as he was over the sudden turn of events, his mood seemed to brighten as he and his old CIA friends agreed on a course of action to contain the damage from this ugly episode. Quote, he showed surprising resilience and apparent courage, end quote, his handler wrote admiringly. Von Bolschwing is tough and resourceful, he was glad to report. The ex-Nazi would no doubt soldier on. He was already looking to the future and seemed intent on, quote, clearing his record and reinstating himself as a first-class citizen. And it was another 20 years, believe it or not, before the prosecutors of the Justice Department realized exactly who Otto von Bolschwing was. Another 20 years that he lived an upper-class lifestyle in New York and then in Northern California, living freely. Only for a few months at the end of his life did the shadow of his Nazi past finally come back. On his deathbed, he admitted, yes, he was a Nazi. So I think we're going to take some questions. Thank you. And we're trying to use the microphone for questions right up here on your right. No one? I guess we can go home. Oh, the mic is right up here.
First of all, let me thank you for this important talk. I think it's quite important. Again, I'm not from America, I'm from the Caribbean. So I'm really outsider here, which is important. 3 questions.
Yes.
Well, 2 questions. Let me squeeze it to 2. The first question is, although you start off trying to create a context against which all of this happened, paperclip, the spies, et cetera, I think you leave us a little bit hanging here. How could a country that claims to be a democracy, stands up for freedom and human rights, protect people, the oppressed internationally, et cetera, ultimately, and I really don't want to hear the justification of the Cold War, because I don't completely buy that. But how can such a country, quite well know, fully aware of who they're working with, decide to go ahead with these people? Let me be provocative and maybe give an answer myself, okay?
Sure, go for it.
And it could be very provocative, what I'm going to say
Sure.
here. Could it be that the history of the United States, right? The slaughter of Indians, the enslavement of black people, what they had done in the Philippines, in my beloved Caribbean, where they had, behaved in very horrific fashions, that there was, in essence, a certain, the brutality of the Germans was not a very big problem to them to extent under certain conditions. That's the first thing. Secondly, there's some talk now about the possibility that the Nazis contributed to, indirectly or directly, to a kind of a heating up of the Cold War, right? That they came in and they were fiercely type of thing, and that this thing may have infected the developing Cold War. Did you see any of that? Did you get any of that? Some writers are seemingly suggesting this, who are looking at paperclip and other type of things. So, if you can maybe say something about these 2 things, that would be very appreciated.
Well, I mean, the question of how could this have possibly happened is really the ultimate question, and is a matter for probably philosophers as much as historians and moral theologians. But I think a lot of it, whether you accept it or not, was about the Cold War. It was about the fear of confronting a new enemy, the Soviets, and very quickly forgetting about the old one that we had just defeated, the Nazis. And I think that fear and that embrace, if you will, of at least some Nazis and Nazi collaborators was clearly fueled by, a lingering anti-Semitism. When you have people like General Patton, who were, openly denouncing prisoners under him as locusts, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, clearly that was an attitude. His attitude, I think, was extreme even for the times, but unfortunately not all that uncommon. So I think it was the Cold War and anti-Semitism. As far as whether or not the Nazis fueled the Cold War, I mean, it did in an indirect way, in the sense that I mentioned Allen Dulles, who met with Himmler's chief of staff even before the war was over, and there's a section of the book where I talk about how that really led to the opening salvo in the Cold War, because what happened there was that Stalin found out about Dulles meeting with General Wolf, the Himmler chief of staff, and was furious because the U.S., because FDR had promised, we are not going to negotiate. At Yalta, the big 3 had made a commitment. We will not negotiate with Nazis, with people who have perpetrated such horrible atrocities. And here was Allen Dulles meeting, over scotch with General Wolf. And Stalin sent a series of blistering cables to FDR, and FDR had to write back on his deathbed. He died just a few weeks after this, saying, you double-crossed us, essentially, and you're already plotting ways to use the Nazis against us when we're still fighting a war. And some historians, I think correctly, view this as sort of the opening moment of the Cold War, even before the war was over.
Your collar.
Oh, okay, all right. Oh, I look worse than that. Don't worry. If that's all I've got going, it's.
So I just wondered if you had thoughts and any sense of financial payoffs related to all these people able to get where they got. That's all.
I didn't find evidence of direct financial payoffs for protection for any of the Nazis, but certainly. a number of them went on to very lucrative careers. I mentioned Otto von Bolschwing, who was, a big-time international businessman who would go back to Germany and was involved in chemical productions in Germany, and that was partly through the help of the United States and the CIA. I also mentioned General Wolf, the one that Dulles befriended, and he spent. He originally was facing execution at Nuremberg as one of the top dozen Nazis involved in the war. And thanks to Dulles, he was eliminated as a defendant and was merely then a witness. Again, Himmler's chief of staff was just a witness to Nazi war atrocities, not actually a defendant. He had to spend a couple of years in a POW camp. Dulles couldn't get him out of the POW camp completely, but he was allowed to carry a gun, and he would go off boating on a yacht on the weekends. So his prison confinement was not exactly what one would consider normal prison time. And as far as the financial rewards, he actually then wrote letters to Dulles, who had helped him escape war crime prosecution, wanting to be reimbursed for all of his lost time in the POW camps, because he had a business career to resume, and this was costing him money. And so one of Dulles's aides wrote back. He literally put in for like dry cleaning and tailoring and clothes and his This is in like around 1951, and one of Dulles's aides wrote back to one of Wolf's aides saying, he should thank his lucky stars. He's lucky he didn't lose a lot more than his shirt.
You mentioned at the beginning that the Jews were victims, and that I do not take lightly as a Jew. I mean, that part really disturbs me.
It's
and I
incredible.
listened to you yesterday on Fresh Air, which is what brought me here tonight. But also, it's a betrayal of our soldiers. I mean, I've visited graves in Europe, and I've seen the gravestones in Normandy facing the west, so our soldiers could be laid facing the United States when they were buried there. I just find this, I'm just incredulous how any of this can be justified by the government.
Well, as I said, yeah, the most eye-opening part of the research for me was probably the condition of the survivors as prisoners. I had sort of a vague idea before I started researching this book that, it was tough for them to get into America. It was tough to get into Palestine. I had read, as many of you probably have, Exodus by Leonora. So yeah, I knew that they weren't, life wasn't great. But I had really no sense that they were literally still prisoners behind barbed wire under armed guard.
But did they give any consideration also to the military and the people who sacrificed their lives for that war?
Well, the military, they were the ones who were guarding over them. They were running the camps under Patton.
It's hard to...
Sad.
I'm wondering how many European collaborators that weren't German we brought over, but were pro-Nazi and rounded up Jews in their own countries.
Well, most of the ones who made it into the United States were not from Germany itself. There were some, probably in the hundreds, who were Germans. Otto von Bolschwing, the guy I mentioned, the Eichmann aide, he was German through and through, and there were other people like him. But probably the vast majority of the 10,000 or so Nazi collaborators who made it to the U.S. were from Eastern Europe. I talked about the floodgates from Eastern Europe, from the Baltics and elsewhere, who came into the U.S. and included thousands of Nazi collaborators who were running concentration camps, who were interrogated and rounding up Jews. That was the biggest group of Nazi fugitives to make it into the U.S., not from Germany itself.
What happened to the Jews who you said were treated as Axis because they were German Jews, or
the policies
get it worse?
The policies in beginning around late 1946 eased up a little bit. The conditions for the survivors in the DP camps did improve. Patton died, which maybe was part of the reason. And the immigration policies loosened up a bit. So beginning in 1947, 48, it became a little bit easier. But thousands of them had died before that happened in the DP camps. And meanwhile, Nazis were coming in even bigger numbers. I mean, amazingly, there was a period in the early 1950s under the immigration laws where being a Nazi was not a ban to getting into the United States. And that became a legal problem years and years later when the Justice Department started going after these guys in the 1980s, because they couldn't claim that they violated immigration policy because it wasn't illegal to be a Nazi and come into the United States. So they had a bit of a problem on their hands.
One more thing. As a Jew, I can't ask only one question. I have to. I'm shocked at how well a lot of the Nazi prisoners lived. That the American GIs didn't hate him as much as the Russian GIs did.
You would think,
I mean, they were fighting him for years.
Yeah.
And you said Eisenhower walked through the camps with Patton and saw how badly the Jews were treated?
Right.
Well,
Patton talks about that in his journal, that Eisenhower, to his credit, seemed kind of shocked by all this.
He's the guy who led German villagers through Dachau, was it? Because he said he didn't want people to say it never happened, and that is what happened.
And Patton publicly said similar things. You know, publicly Patton said the right things about the horror of the concentration camps and liberating Dachau. I mean, he was a good politician in that sense, who publicly was repulsed. But then you see what he writes in his journals and what he actually did in practice at the camps.
So did Truman or Eisenhower or anyone powerful in America from the beginning after the war fight this? Did they say that, we don't want Nazis, we want to liberate the prisoners of Nazis?
There were people at the State Department who were adamantly opposed to the idea of bringing in the scientists. The Pentagon really wanted that. People like Alan Dulles really wanted that at what became the CIA. There were people at the State Department who said this will be a black mark in history and we can't do this. And basically they lost that debate.
No one cared about the prisoners, the Jews, the other prisoners?
After that report that I mentioned to Truman, where you had the dean of the Penn Law School comparing the U.S. displaced person camps to Nazi concentration camps, things did improve a bit. I mean, it was a slow process, but they were not treated as reviled prisoners to the extent that they had been in those first 6 months or so after the war. So
thank you. You've done a great service.
Oh,
thank you very much. Oh, I didn't realize there were people.
Hello.
Hi. So, in light of this exposure of this very important piece of history that needs to be corrected, here we are in the 21st century with descendants of those people who came here and have to somehow reconcile their own. I mean, I feel like we keep passing generation to generation these kinds of traumatic experiences. So do you have any suggestions for how we can go forward now that this information is out? And I also was curious as to how it's being received by people who are officials in the Justice Department and the State Department.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing the government could do to move forward would be to acknowledge, its past behavior. When I wrote the story I mentioned for the Times last week about the Nazi spies, the CIA declined comment, as if we were talking about, some episode in 2013 rather than, 1946. It would be nice if there were kind of the equivalent of a truth commission to say, yeah, this is what we did and it was wrong, and it was driven by irrational fear and moral indifference, etc. You asked about the families and the later generations. I actually spent a lot of time talking to the children of a number of these Nazis, and I have a whole chapter on that in the book. And overwhelmingly, the children believe that their fathers were wrongly accused, that they were not guilty of the atrocities that the Justice Department would later accuse them of. They were the victims of Soviet propaganda, which is something that J. Edgar Hoover said for years and years. People were accused, his FBI informants would be accused of being Nazis internally, and he would say that's just communists talking. And the children today believe essentially that same thing, despite what I'd say is overwhelming evidence. There's one son, the son of Otto von Bolschwing, who I talked about at length, who actually did come to terms with his father being the monster that they accused him of being. He at first denied it too for a long time, and then he began looking at things like that report on the Jewish problem, and he realized this was my father. So.
Thank you.
Americans are a curious people, and so it confounds me that adult Nazis, ex-Nazis, Germans with a heavy German accent, presumably, can come to America and find solid mid-level careers, and no one's saying, "What did you do during the war?" So
some people did later on. When you have to remember, sort of in the 50s and 60s, the government and the public at large seemed completely indifferent to the question of whether there were Nazis and Nazi collaborators in the U.S. There were some journalists and others who I write about who tried to bring attention to this in the 60s. And in fact, not only were they ignored, but this left-wing journalist who was writing these exposés about Nazis in our midst, the thanks he got from the FBI was that they wiretapped him for years and sent FBI agents to follow him while he gathered his evidence. So it was only in the 1970s and 1980s that people started waking up to the idea that this guy may have been a concentration camp guard or a supervisor or an SS officer or worse. You almost had, at times, an overreaction in what you're suggesting, where you had sort of, if you had there were actual cases where someone who had a grudge against their neighbor would say, who had a German accent, would say he was a Nazi, and it turns out really he just didn't like his neighbor. So by the 80s, we were finally going after these guys, and then you actually had people who really weren't Nazis who were swept up in all this. So we went from one extreme to the other.
And about the
displaced
death camps
persons
that had been turned into prisons for the former Holocaust arrestees. Where was the press? Didn't the American press look at that situation and say something?
Surprisingly, there actually were stories about this. That report to Truman, which I had never heard of before I started my research, actually did get a fair amount of press in the U.S. Jewish groups were complaining both before and after the report, and were drawing attention to this. There was a report in Stars and Stripes a month or two after the war ended, out of Italy, where you still had Germany had surrendered 6 weeks, 2 months earlier, or something like that, and you still had Nazi SS officers running villages and towns in Italy. And Stars and Stripes wrote a story with a headline something to the effect of, "Did we actually win the war?" So there were stories. I don't think the press totally abdicated its responsibility, but when it came to what the CIA was doing and the other intelligence agencies, that stuff is so difficult to report on.
I was thinking more about the
conditions. Yeah. Once it took a while for the reports to get back to the U.S. Jewish groups. Once it got back to the U.S. Jewish groups, there actually was not overwhelming press attention, but there were stories.
And one final question.
Well, we really don't have time for that.
Okay.
I mean, that was going to be the last question, but if you want to ask a quick one, and then we've got to wrap it up.
Is it anticipated that Hoover's name will remain on the new FBI headquarters building?
I've wondered that same thing. I don't think they've actually said, but I would be shocked if it did. I'd be shocked. And in that story that I did, I mentioned for the Times about the Nazi spies, unlike the CIA, which declined comment, the FBI actually did say that essentially a lot of this was J. Edgar Hoover's fault. So it's sort of easy to throw J. Edgar Hoover under the bus these days. So thank you. Thank you very much.